name is Zachary Chitwood, and I am a lecturer in Byzantine Studies at the Johannes Gutenberg University of Mainz in Germany. As you can probably tell from my accent, and my name, I am, however, not German. I'm originally an American, US American researcher. I did my PhD at Princeton University under John Halden. And I am currently the principal investigator for an ERC, European Research Council, starting grant on Mount Athos in medieval Eastern Mediterranean society, 850 to 1550. I'm sorry, I just will try and, yes. Contextualizing the history of a monastic republic. And many of you probably already know something about Mount Athos, at the very least in sort of popular culture and as a center of Orthodox monasticism. But the goal of the project, the main goal is to contextualize Mount Athos as a microcosm of the Eastern Mediterranean world, and really the entire Orthodox world. It's a place where many different cultures and languages mixed, and for instance, sovereigns from all over the Slavic world or the Eastern Mediterranean world came to patronize or even sometimes to visit. And the goal of the project is to create an open access digital database of all persons associated with Mount Athos in this period. So every monk, every patron, every visitor or pilgrim to the Holy Mountain in the medieval period will be accounted for in this database, and thereby will be able, for the first time as scholars, to see very clearly connections between Mount Athos and other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean world, not only on the basis of famous individuals, like for instance, Maxim Grec, but on a statistical basis. We'll be able to say, for instance, we can see that there were 300 monks from Trebizond that were on Athos in a particular century. That's just one made up example because we haven't completed the database yet, but that's the goal. And in addition to myself, I'm the specialist for Greek sources. Given the wide variety of languages that we use on Athos, we also have a Georgian specialist, Tinetin Pons, and we also have a Slavicist, Kiru Maximovich. And with this constellation of different specialities and specialized knowledge, we will hopefully be able to make a database, create a database of all these people. In addition, we also have an Ottomanist who is a resident in the UK, Vanessa de Albadia. So with that, I will go ahead and start my talk about which is entitled The Eye of the Oikoumene, Mount Athos as the Center of the Byzantine World. And I'll begin with a quotation from Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Asia, Europe are corners of the universe. All the sea a drop in the universe. Athos, a little clod of the universe. All the present time is a point in eternity. All things are little, changeable, perishable. Unquote. This quotation from the famed Meditations of the philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius describes Mount Athos as nothing more than, quote, a little clod of the universe, unquote. His larger point, that even the largest imaginable physical features are nothing more than a speck in the universe, is well taken. Even so, it suggests how physically impressive and forbidding Athos's landscape has always been. An observer of Athos in antiquity, though he might have undoubtedly been impressed by the awesome majesty of the peak rising in the middle of the easternmost finger of the Halkidiki Peninsula, never would have imagined that the site would become the focus of intense human habitation. Though the Roman geographer Strabo claims that 5 cities could be found on the peninsula in this period, none of their locations have been verified by archaeology. Nor the meager human presence on Athos nor did the meager human presence on Athos significantly increase until perhaps the 9th century of the Common Era. I chose to begin my lecture on Mount Athos with this quotation for a number of reasons. One reason is that I wanted to describe the Holy Mountain in an unusual way, far from our traditional associations with the place. It is at this time that I can perhaps give a quick overview of what Mount Athos is today, even though most of you probably know something about the mountain itself. Mount Athos is a semi-autonomous monastic confederation consisting of 20 main monasteries, almost all of which were founded in the Middle Ages, the one exception being Stavronikita, which was founded in the 1540s, so under Ottoman rule. In an area about 45 kilometers and varying between 5 and 10 kilometers in length, live around 2,000 monks. Most of them are residents of Cenobitic monasteries, that is, communities practicing the common monastic life, marked by shared governance, eating, and celebration of the liturgy. Even though the Cenobitic lifestyle has the upper hand today, there still remain a substantial number of hermits, as well as monks inhabiting smaller monasteries, so-called sketes. Historically, especially in the post-medieval period, a fluid form of common monastic life, designated idiorhythmic, from the Greek idiorhythmia, was widely practiced, and was perhaps even the prevalent form of monastic life in the 17th and 18th centuries. Another fact that most people know about Mount Athos is that women, as well as female animals, theoretically, are forbidden from visiting it. This rule, called abaton, untrodden in Greek, is of uncertain origin, but first seems to have been practiced within the context of Studite monasticism. The principle of abaton envisions an absolute division of the male and the female. Though today we primarily associate it with female exclusion from male monastic reserves, in the medieval period it was equally used to designate male exclusion from female convents. Yet, it would be facile and misleading to assume that women were not connected with Athos, as we will see in this lecture. This point was brought home by a discovery reported by International News in December of 2019, whereby supposedly female remains were discovered in a chapel dedicated to St. Athanasius on Mount Athos. The headline displayed here was from The Guardian. The only complete testaments transmitted in Greek by women from the medieval period, and that's only 2 in fact, were preserved in Athenite monasteries, and in both cases substantially benefited Athenite houses. Women have, moreover, visited Mount Athos while the abaton rule was in effect, either secretly, as in the case of a string of visits made by women in disguise in the 19th and 20th centuries, or openly, as when Yelena, the consort of Stephen Dusan, the Serbian ruler, tarried on the Holy Mountain during the outbreak of the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century. To further complicate this picture of the role of gender on Mount Athos, during its long history, there were also eunuch monks, castrated monks, whom Byzantine thinkers variously judged as not wholly male or perhaps representing a third gender. In short, the role of gender on Mount Athos is rather more complex than the principle of abaton might at first suggest. So much for what Mount Athos is today. How then, however, did Mount Athos transform, to use Marcus Aurelius's words, from a little clod of the universe to become the most important center of Orthodox monasticism in the world today? Or, as some late medieval writers put it, how did Athos become the eye of the Oikoumene, the center of the world, more important even than Constantinople? In what follows, I will give a brief history of Mount Athos, and thereby attempt to underline how the history of Byzantium and Byzantine civilization, you might say, might be sketched from the Athenite perspective. According to Herodotus, the Persian king Xerxes had a canal dug at the narrowest point of the Athos Peninsula during his invasion of Greece in 480 BCE. He also mentions 5 cities to the south of the canal, which would have stood somewhere within the boundaries of the present-day monastic republic. But, as I've already stated, none of these cities have been found by archaeologists. Some archaeologists have claimed to have found remains of Xerxes' canal, but again, that is disputed in the scholarship. Mount Athos might have become a very different place if the plans of the architect Dinokrates in the 4th century BCE had come to fruition. As related in Vitruvius's De Architectura, this ambitious young architect approached Alexander the Great with a proposal to transform the whole of Mount Athos into a sculpture of the great king. Though reportedly rejected by the Macedonian conqueror, the idea enjoyed a lively afterlife in the imagination of later artists and writers. Here is one rendering dreamed up in 1725 by Johann Bernhard Fischer von Ehler. Following the description in Vitruvius, this monument would have shown Alexander's right hand disposing the waters of Athos down its slope, while his left hand would have touched the walls of a great city. After antiquity, it appears that Mount Athos became essentially devoid of permanent human habitation, as it would perhaps remain until the 9th century. Before delving into the historical roots of monasticism on Mount Athos, it is worth relating what the later monastic communities believed happened to the Holy Mountain during this period, still in antiquity. While these legends have no historical basis, they are important in that they elucidate how the monks construed Athos's relationship with the Roman past. According to the Athenite collection of oral histories known as the Patria, the Roman Emperor Caracalla can be credited with the foundation of today's Caracallu monastery, though the tradition does not explain why this pagan emperor would have had any interest in founding a Christian monastery. Nor is Caracalla the only Roman emperor to have supposedly patronized Athos. As the Patria would have it, Constantine the Great established 3 churches on Athos. They were, however, according to this text, utterly annihilated by Julian the Apostate. Nor does the Holy Mountain's Roman pedigree stop there. Vatos, the supposed brother of Emperor Theodosius I, again according to the Patria, sent his son with a fleet to Constantinople. But this armada encountered a terrible storm. Vatos' son was thrown into the sea, and in a last act of desperation, called upon the Virgin Mary to save him. This she did by depositing him on Athos' shores, but she admonished him to reestablish one of the 3 churches that Constantine had founded on the peninsula, which were later destroyed by Julian the Apostate. And just as a side remark, for those of you who are looking for a PhD thesis or a research topic, there are so many of these legends regarding especially, but not just Roman emperors, founding or otherwise interacting with Athenite monasteries. One could do a very interesting paper or thesis on this topic, and it really hasn't been explored in detail. So the Virgin Mary would at this point already, that is in the 4th century, have enjoyed a special relationship with the Holy Mountain, at least in the tradition of the Athenite monastic communities. The idea that the Virgin Mary had a particular connection with Athos was voiced already in the late Middle Ages, but the full legend of her role in the early history of the peninsula was not articulated until somewhat later. The Patria would have it as follows. So, quote, "After the awesome resurrection of the great Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, all the apostles were gathered together in an upper room in Jerusalem with Maria, the mother of Jesus. They were casting lots amongst themselves as to the name of each place to which one of the apostles would depart to preach. And the Mother of God asked about her lot, lest she be left without an allotment. And it is said, since for her sake the lots were divided, the lot fell to her that she should depart to Iberia, Georgia, and she received it gladly and wanted to depart thence. The angel Gabriel appeared, however, and said to her, 'Depart not, O Virgin, from the land of Judea. This has been ordered to you by him whom you bore. This land allotted to you shall be illuminated by your person in later times, and shall not remain unworked.'" So we have here, according to the Patria, this idea that when the apostles were dividing up the world as to who should preach where, the Virgin Mary should also receive a portion, and she was given Iberia. But things, as we'll see, did not work out that way. The story continues with the Virgin Mary deciding to visit St. Lazarus on Cyprus. When she embarked on a boat with John the Evangelist, the ship was seized by a violent wind and deposited on Mount Athos at the quay of Clement. And here you can see a modern depiction of what happened next. This is an icon at the entrance to Iviron Monastery on Mount Athos. And you can see the Virgin Mary here in the front of the ship. At that time, so the story goes, Athos was a major pilgrimage site for the god Apollo, and pagans came from all over the world to venerate him there. At Mary's arrival on Athos, a great voice boomed from all the idols there to hurry to the quay of Clement to meet Mary. Converging upon the boat, the pagans took Mary and everyone else in the boat to their temple. Mary then preached to the assembled Athenites, performed many miracles for them, and baptized them. She also appointed a certain Clement as bishop over them. With her ministry completed, the Mother of God now spoke as follows. Quote, "This mountain was given to me by my son and my God as my allotment, and I thank him that he did not allow me to be without a portion." She then addressed a prayer to Jesus. "My son and God, bless this place and pour out your mercy upon it, up until the fulfillment of the age, and upon those residing upon it, on account of your name and my own, with little toil and struggle, forgive them their trespasses and deliver them from the eternal damnation. Fill them with every good thing in this age and in the eternal life to come, and glorify this place above every place, and extend their tabernacles upon it from peak to peak, from north to south, and preserve them from every enemy, both seen and unseen." She then embarked once again upon her boat, and this time succeeded in reaching Lazarus on Cyprus. Though this legend, as transmitted by the Patria, has no basis in historical fact, it is nonetheless illuminating for our purposes because the Virgin Mary's visit anchored Athos within Byzantine and Orthodox sacred geography. Like the great patriarchates, Athos had been visited by a person from Jesus' inner circle, not by a mere apostle, but rather the Mother of God herself. Her missionary activity there is quite similar to the story of Saint Nino, who, according to legend, brought Christianity to Georgia. And in fact, like Nino, the Virgin Mary was able to preach and baptize her pagan converts. In the Orthodox tradition, women are permitted to baptize. Any believers are permitted to baptize. So that's how that was able to come about. The legends we have so far discussed regarding the origins of Mount Athos were formulated many centuries after monastic communities had already existed there in order to rationalize the prominent stature which the Holy Mountain had by then acquired. The historical origins of monasticism on Mount Athos are more complex and are still debated within scholarship. What can be stated with some certainty is that there is no compelling evidence for any sort of significant monastic presence on Athos before the 9th century. The first monastic personality to be associated with Mount Athos is Peter the Athenite, a shadowy, semi-legendary figure who supposedly spent over half a century on the Holy Mountain in the late 8th and early 9th century. Canons testifying to his life appear around the middle of the 9th century, and his legend became the subject of a vita written by an Athenite monk named Nicholas, sometime between roughly 980 and the middle of the 11th century. According to Nicholas's vita, in his youth, Peter had been a soldier who was captured while on campaign with the Byzantine army in Syria. While imprisoned at Samara, Peter prayed to Saints Nicholas and Simeon for aid and promised a journey to Rome to receive tonsure. With their miraculous succor, Peter managed to escape and become a monk at Rome. Yet, on his return journey, he received a vision of the Mother of God while at sea. In this revelation, he saw St. Nicholas and the Theotokos, and the latter stated, then and there, quote, "His Peter's place of rest shall be upon Athos, which I received as my allotment from my Son and God, so that those fleeing worldly as well as spiritual ruin and opposing it to the greatest of their ability, by calling upon my name in truth and faith and disposition, might achieve a present life free from care, and inherit a heavenly one through works pleasing to God. For I am well pleased with this place, and my soul rejoices exceedingly in it. For I know well that there will come a day that the order of the monks will fill out from peak to peak, and by the mercy of our Son God, if we cling to the divine commandments, they will not be scattered throughout the entire age. And I will stretch them to the south and north of the said mountain, and they will hold dominion over it from sea to sea, and their name will become famous in every place under the sun. And I will defend those enduring upon it." So we see in this text as well, which is was written considerably earlier than the first written form of the Patria, that this idea that the Virgin Mary has a special connection to Athos was present already in the 10th century. So it seems to have been there in the earliest monastic communities. As the Vita would have it, the boat in which Peter was then seized by a strong wind, and the same convinced the sailors that the wind would not allow them to proceed unless he was allowed to disembark. Thereafter, he was deposited on Athos, where he would remain as a cave-dwelling hermit for the next 5 decades, for 53 years, according to the text. At the end of his life, he was discovered by a hunter, to whom Peter recounted the story of his life. When the hunter later returned to Athos, Peter had departed this life, but the hunter collected his remains, which would become prized relics. With Peter the Athenite, we arrive at the threshold between history and legend. For by the time legends began to circulate about his life, we received the first credible reports of monastic communities on the Holy Mountain. The historian Genesios records that a contingent of Athenite monks participated in the procession to celebrate the restoration of icon veneration at Constantinople in 843. This is, by the way, a much disputed passage about whether that is that reflected reality or whether that's a 10th century insertion. And I won't get into the debate here, but that's just to note. Ephemios the Younger, a transplant from another Byzantine Alpine monastic confederation on Bithynian Olympus, came to Athos around the year 859. The holdings of the archives of the Athenite monasteries are by far the richest surviving collection of archival material from the Byzantine period. And indeed, one can make a similar case for their Ottoman holdings, most of which remains uncatalogued. Of the around 1,200 Byzantine legal documents, which include charters, testaments, acts of donation, delimitations of property, etc., which survive from the Athenite archives, the very first document is an imperial grant of privilege, a so-called sigillion, of Emperor Basil I from the year 883. And you can see here on the slide an old black and white photograph of what this document looks like. It has recently been argued that the document was an entirely new grant of rights rather than a reconfirmation of earlier privileges. As such, it essentially created a monastic preserve on the peninsula where Mount Athos is located, up to and including the monastery founded by the charismatic monk John Kollevos. The monks in this area were freed from extraordinary imperial vexations, and non-monks, including shepherds and herders, were forbidden from trespassing on Athos. As becomes clear from a later act of Basil's successor, Leo VI, John Kollevos and his monastery had acquired a preponderant position at the end of the 9th century on Athos, and had indeed been granted ownership of the entire peninsula outright at the time of Leo's accession in 886. His monastery was attested as imperial, basiliki, in a document from the year 927, but had perhaps already achieved this status during the lifetime of John Kollevos himself. By the middle of the 10th century, there was clearly a thriving monastic community upon the Holy Mountain. At this point, however, it is important to emphasize that Athos's position as the premier monastic center in the Byzantine world was by no means assured. In fact, Athos was but one of many mountain monastic centers. We can deduce the essential equivalence of Athos to these other monastic centers on the basis of petitions of emperors, as well as the granting of imperial stipends to said centers from this period. For instance, the Emperor Romanos I Lekapenos instituted a stipend of 1 gold coin per year for every monk on Athos, Olympus, and Kymenos in Bithynia, Parakios, Latros, and Chrysipergi. It is telling that this was a payment to the monasteries in the mountains. 2 letters of Constantine VII addressed to Olympus, Latros, Kymenos, and Athos asked to pray for the success of the imperial armies, while a military oration of the same emperor requested the prayer of monks for the army of the east. Nicephorus II Phocas likewise petitioned the monks of Kymenos, Olympus, and Athos to pray for victory in his Cretan campaign. So as we see in all of these different examples, Athos is just but one of many monastic centers, and it's basically equivalent to all the others. It's not given any sort of preeminence over the other mountain monastic centers. As far as these monastic confederations were concerned, Athos was by no means the oldest or considered the most venerable. Its hermits and saints were not as famous as those of Bithynian Olympus, for instance. for it was there that the foremost holy man of the iconoclast period, Ioannikios, had resided. And it was from Ioannikios, according to the Vita of Ephemius the Younger, that the saint received an early recognition of his virtue, for he was falsely accused of murder by Ioannikios in order to test his humility. Ephemios left Olympus to practice asceticism on Athos, but he often departed from the holy mountain, especially to go to Thessaloniki, where he even spent some time as a pillar saint. Alongside his male monastery, he also founded a convent for women. He installed a grandchild to head each monastery. His monastery of Peristere, located to the east of Thessaloniki, well outside the boundaries of Mount Athos, received imperial status in 897. Thus Athos, though itself an important monastic center, was part and parcel of a larger monastic revival in Byzantium after 843. Though some of its monasteries by the end of the 9th century enjoyed imperial support, this was by no means an exclusively Athenite phenomenon. The Lavra of Stylos on Mount Latros, near modern Milet, for instance, was founded in the 920s and received generous benefactions from Constantine VII or Pyrogenitos. Likewise, two Bithynian monasteries enjoyed close imperial ties. Constantine, Mount Olympus, to return to Mount Olympus, moreover, enjoyed particular imperial favor. Constantine VII even visited this monastic center. Romanos I was especially attached to an Olympian monk, one Thermocaites, who had once been a military governor or strategos. Towards the end of Romanos' life, while living in exile on the island of Croti and fearing his coming death, Romanos arranged to have 300 monks come visit him from across the Christian world, including Jerusalem and Rome. After consulting with these holy men, he wrote out a list of his many sins on a document, tachyon, and he sent a large sum of gold to the monks of Mount Olympus, and in particular to the aforementioned Thermocaites, to pray for his soul and the forgiveness of his sins. So in this example as well, we see Mount Olympus being, Mount Olympus in Bithynia being pointed out as a special monastic center in Athos. Thus, while Athos certainly was an important monastic center around 950, it was by no means preeminent, nor did it appear to have special advantages over its fellow monastic centers that would have guaranteed its rise to prominence. This might be one of those cases in history where the life and work of one man did in fact have a profound impact on developments during his own time afterwards. And in the case of Athos, this man was Athanasius the Athenite. Born in Trebizond as Abramios, Athanasius received higher education in Constantinople. There he was introduced to Michael Meleinos, an abbot of the Lavra on Mount Kimenos and a scion of a leading aristocratic family, before deciding to embark on a monastic vocation himself. It was through Michael that Athanasius met the general Nikephoros Phokas, the nephew of Michael, and the general was so impressed by Athanasius' virtue that he made him his confessor. According to the so-called B version of Athanasius' Vita, already while Athanasius was a monk on Mount Kimenos, Nikephoros approached him and confided that he wanted to enter the monastic life under Athanasius' tutelage. Though Nikephoros' meteoric rise as a successful general prevented him from acting upon this vow immediately, he repeated his wish to become a monk shortly after he had conquered Crete at the conclusion of the 960-961 campaign, where Athanasius, who had in the meantime moved to Athos, visited him. And here we have a quotation from the Vita B of Athanasius of Athos. So this is Nikephoros Phokas speaking to Athanasius. Quote, "Father, the monk's earlier fear of the ill-named Hagarenes has already been banished from the mountain through your prayers. The time has come, for which I have long been yearning, to flee the affairs of this world. All we need to do now is to build a place for us to live. So I beg your holiness, first of all, to build us cells in which to pursue spiritual tranquility, and to establish a church and fit it out for a Cenobitic community. There, you and I, together with 3 other brethren, may live the solitary life in cells, designed for the pursuit of spiritual tranquility. But on Sundays, we may come together in the Lavra to partake of the divine sacraments and eat together with the brethren and the superior. and then leave again, unquote. The matter of the vow of Nicephorus would eventually cause much anguish, for shortly later, in 963, Nicephorus Phocas attained the imperial throne, thus seemingly breaking his promise to become a monk for good. Nonetheless, after his initial disappointment, Athanasius made the journey to Constantinople to visit the now emperor Nicephorus, forgave him, and in recompense received a crucible granting his Athenite monastery an annual stipend of 244 gold coins. Though even at this point, Nicephorus repeated his desire to eventually join Athanasius as a monk, he never did so, and was murdered by his fellow general John Tzimiskes in 969. Sensing an opportunity, jealous monks on Athos now appealed to the new emperor and stated that Athanasius had jeopardized the spiritual isolation and splendor of the Holy Mountain with his building of churches, luxurious buildings, harbors, and water channels, and by bringing in teams of oxen. He had, so they said, transformed the mountain into a worldly place. Yet after Athanasius sailed to Constantinople at the request of the emperor, Tzimiskes indicated his support for Athanasius by ignoring these complaints and granting another annual stipend of 244 gold coins to the monastery. This was a wise move on Tzimiskes' part, where Athanasius and his monastery might have acted as a rallying point for Nicephorus' relatives and supporters to take vengeance on the usurper. At this point, it is worth dwelling for a moment to discuss the character of Athanasius' establishment, the so-called Great Labra, the Augusti Labra. As the complaints of his opponents and the generous imperial stipends granted to it suggest, the Labra was a fabulously wealthy monastery by the end of the 10th century. In what at first seems a paradox, the growing wealth of the Labra seemed to contradict the principles of Athanasius and his supporters, who favored a return to the morally rigorous monasticism of late antiquity. In fact, almost certainly with Athanasius' support, the Emperor Nicephorus Phocas had promulgated a law in 964 which forbade the foundation of new monasteries and pious foundations, or of endowing existing ones with land or buildings. Instead, founders were to focus their energies on giving alms to the poor and on renewing existing monasteries and philanthropic institutions. The novel described the great wealth of these institutions in vivid terms, and I will quote from it here. But now as I behold the evident disease of the monasteries and even the pious foundations, for a disease is what I call this insatiety, I know not what remedy I shall devise, or how I shall restrain their moderation. Which of the fathers are they obeying? From which source are they drawing inspiration? That they have been led to such great excess and false frenzies, to speak in the words of the holy David. The hours upon hours they hasten to acquire thousands of acres of land, lavish buildings, herds of horses, cattle, camels, and other beasts beyond counting, stretching the whole concern of their soul to embrace these things, with the result that monastic practices are in no way different from worldly life, loaded with cares. Excepted from this rule were cells and so-called lavras in deserted regions, which, seemingly in Nicephorus' view, adhered to the principles of the Egyptian and Palestinian fathers. Nonetheless, the paradox of attaining great wealth while remaining true to the monastic virtue of poverty was, in Athanasius' case, never resolved, and would constitute a recurring problem on Mount Athos in the following centuries. A second characteristic of Athanasius' great Labra, and Mount Athos more generally in the second half of the 10th century, was the impressive cultural variety of the monks. In Athanasius' edict, it is related that, quote, already a great multitude of people from all sorts of different origins were flocking to them, from Rome itself, from Italy, Calabria, Amalfi, Iberia, and Armenia, not only ordinary and common people, but well-born and wealthy men as well, unquote. While some of these non-Byzantine monks were content to remain minorities within larger monastic communities, as with a large number of Chalcedonian Armenians who joined Oikoumene, other groups formed so-called ethnic monasteries. The two most prominent early examples were Eviron, which was founded by a group of Georgian monks with the financial support of George Jarnikios, a Georgian general of royal pedigree in Byzantine service. Though sometimes the victim of ethnic prejudices on the part of the Greek monks, its erudite residents would translate many Greek texts into Georgian, and vice versa, occasionally even Georgian texts into Greek, with the Christianized example of the Buddha legend, the romance of Varlam and Ulasid, being the most famous example. The Georgian monks enjoyed a special relationship with another group that formed a second major ethnic monastery of Mount Athos, that of the South Italian Amalfitans. Their community had been founded by Leo, the brother of the Duke of Benevento, around 979-980, and their monastery remained one of the most prominent on Athos into the 13th century. At the time of Athanasius' death in 1001, he met his demise, fittingly enough, while assisting in a building project when a ladder toppled over. Athos had many large and wealthy monasteries and was home to a community of some thousands of monks, though we can never know the exact number. After the reign of Basil II ended in 1025, the Athenite houses were the object of less imperial solicitude and perhaps less patronage more generally. For the rest of the 11th century and almost the whole of the 12th century, especially during the reign of the Komnenian dynasty. Though the Athenite monasteries did not enjoy the same degree of imperial support over much of the 11th and 12th centuries as they had during the Golden Age from roughly 950 to 1025, they can hardly be said to have suffered a major decline in wealth or prestige during this period. Nonetheless, it is important to note that when emperors undertook major prestige projects in the period after 1025, such undertakings were normally located in the imperial capital, and when this was not the case, then in non-Athenite provincial centers. Just to cite a few examples, Constantine IX Manimakos, who reigned from 1042 to 1055, one of the most monk-loving emperors, or monk-friendly emperors of this period, lavishly endowed a new monastery on the island of Chios, near Moni, as well as a monastic complex in the capital, dedicated to St. George at Mangana. In addition, probably at the behest of his mistress, Maria Skurena, he was generous to the Besse monastery on Mount Goreska. The Komneni created two grand philanthropic complexes in Constantinople, most notably the Orphanotropion under Alexius I and the Pantocrator under John II. Alexius was also instrumental in the founding of the monastery of St. John the Theologian on Patmos by the monk Christodoulos. The reign of the Komneni in the 11th and 12th centuries oversaw a number of events that would decisively influence the further development of Mount Athos. First, of the major mountainous monastic centers of the 10th century, only Athos survived the loss of most of Asia Minor to the Seljuk Turks intact. While Mount Ganos in Thrace was a smaller monastic center seemingly organized along Athenite lines that had emerged in the 10th century, its stature was not comparable to that of Athos, and it is primarily attested via lead seals. From the 11th century onwards, new Orthodox monastic confederations, such as Puteora and Paoria, would emerge only in the empire's European half. By the 12th century, Athos was far wealthier and more venerable than any of its European rivals. The prominence of Mount Athos as a center of Orthodox spirituality, coupled with the rapid decline of Byzantine state power at the end of the 12th century, offered new opportunities for other Orthodox principalities to showcase their prestige by patronizing the Holy Mountains monasteries. These rulers often, though not always, ruled principalities that belonged to non-Greek cultures. Moreover, sovereign patronage of these houses was fundamentally different than the earlier model of the monasteries of the Amalfitans and Ibiror. For the patrons of these houses had acknowledged Byzantine suzerainty. The new sovereign monastic foundations from around 1200 onwards, by contrast, were expressions of political influence by dynasties often in direct competition with the Byzantines. As the first of what in the medieval West German scholarship has termed Hausklöster, and what French language research has called Fondation Dynastique, is that of Hilandar. 3 documents from the monastery's archive from the years 1198 to 9 describe the process by which Sava a sign of the Nemanjic dynasty, and the youngest son of its founder, Stefan Nemanja, sought a monastery together with his father for this new Orthodox principality. While earlier, at the end of 1197, or perhaps the beginning of 1198, Sava and Stefan had convinced the Emperor Alexius III Angelos to grant the ruined monastery of Hilandar and other establishments at a place called Nelie to Batopedi. They now, through the intermediary of the Protos, the president or leader of Mount Athos, and the governing council of Athos, requested a crucible in order to be granted direct control over Hilandar and to refound it as they saw fit, since they feared that Batopedi would extinguish these establishments. In the request of the emperor, they invoked the principle of other foreign houses, such as Ibiron and that of the Amalfitans. It is worth quoting this document. Yet we, knowing that so many monasteries, that is Hilandar and the other establishments at Nelie, would suffer their final loss and disappearance due to the party of the monastery of Batopedi, and that the commemoration of the famous emperors and the elders who had previously labored in them would be lost, have turned to the much beloved Simpenteros, the father of the son-in-law, of your mighty and holy majesty, and his son, the Lord Sava, requesting that they receive the said monasteries in their own right, and establish among them a monastery according to their will, just as other monasteries of your majesty on the mountain of other tongues, such as those of the Iberians, Ibiron, and the Amalfitans. Though the Nemanja dynasty had enjoyed a mixed relationship with the Byzantine Empire, often with protracted periods of conflict, the wording of the petition for the founding of Hilandar still assumed that the emperor had the authority to allow monasteries of other tongues upon Mount Athos. Patronage was still primarily an imperial prerogative, nor was Hilandar the only predominantly Slavic monastery on Athos during this period. Panteleimon had become a Russian Rus monastery by the middle of the 12th century. Yet as the date of the Fourth Crusade neared, Alexius III reacted very differently to another attempt of a fellow Orthodox ruler, this time Queen Tamar of Georgia, to patronize monasteries in Byzantine territory and elsewhere. And this quotation is from the Georgian Chronicle. Further, in the lands of Hellas and the Holy Mountain, as well as in Macedonia and Petritsoni, in regions of Thrace, and in the monasteries of Constantinople, Romana, Isauria, Kuruseti, and all the environs of the Black Mountain and Cyprus. In all these lands, she, Queen Tamar, performed acts of charity, on account of which, hear how God looked on her works. On one occasion, according to their custom, monks from the Black Mountain, Antioch, and the island of Cyprus came out to ask her to perform acts of charity, as well as from the Holy Mountain, that is Mount Athos, and many other places. Tamar, as was her wont, received them like angels and kept them for several days, treating them generously, providing for all their needs. Finally, she gave a large sum of gold to those who traveled the furthest, to share between themselves and all the monasteries. The monks departed, and when they came to Constantinople, the Greek king Alexius Angari, Alexius III Angelos, heard about them. He who had had his brother Isaac's eyes put out and seized the throne. He was in every way a villain, unfit to reign, and abominated by everyone, most especially for his greed. When he saw what a quantity of gold Tamar had given to the monks, he stripped them of it all. Unquote. The chronicle goes on to recount how Tamar retaliated by attacking the eastern territories of the empire, which included sending two scions of the deposed Komneni dynasty, David and Alexios, to invade Trebizond, and thereby found the independent empire of Trebizond. The capture of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade had, as we all know, disastrous political consequences for the Byzantine state. Three successor kingdoms at Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus vied with one another to reestablish a Byzantine empire centered at Constantinople. The period of Latin rule also fundamentally altered the sacred geography of the Orthodox world. The fantastically rich and lavishly endowed monastic foundations of the capital, what Cyril Mengo has termed imperial abbeys, never recovered their former splendor. Though with their relics and imperial pedigree, the monasteries that did survive the sack of Constantinople continued to attract pilgrims, their role as centers of monastic reform and vitality was greatly diminished after 1204. Like the monasteries of Constantinople, the Athenite houses also suffered under Latin rule. A Latin prelate was installed as Bishop of Sevasti, the see with nominal authority over Athos, and established for himself a fortress on the Holy Mountain from which his soldiers harassed the monks and plundered their monasteries. Eventually, Pope Innocent III was forced to intervene and issued a bull on the 17th of January, 1213, which condemned the outrages of the bishop, who in the meantime had been deposed, and placed the monks under his protection. And by the way, I would just mention as an aside, this is but one of several papal documents that place Athos itself or particular Athenite monasteries under papal protection. And again, this is a very interesting topic that I think could be explored in greater detail by future researchers. Athenite legends, though not with a historical basis, depict the 13th century also as a time of persecution by pro-unionist Orthodox, who supported the church policy of Michael VIII Palaiologos and the Patriarch John Bekos. A nadir was reached with the devastation brought on Athos by the Grand Catalan Company from 1307 to 1309. Though Constantinople was recaptured by the Palaiologi in 1261, and it was extensively restored by Michael VIII and Andronicus II, its monasteries never recovered financially from the sack of 1204. By the beginning of the 14th century, after a century of almost continuous turmoil, the Athenite houses had suffered considerably as well, though the existence of the major monasteries never appears to have been seriously threatened. Yet by the middle of the 14th century, Athos experienced a remarkable transformation. Instead of the concerted imperial involvement of its golden age in the second half of the 10th century, it was now not the Byzantine emperor, but rather Orthodox rulers from across the entire Oikoumene, from the entire Orthodox world, who competed with one another to endow and patronize the Holy Mountains monasteries. As with the foundation of Hilandar at the end of the 12th century, Serbian rulers were instrumental in reviving Athenite fortunes. Stefan Dusan, whose realm extended well into northern Greece, lavishly endowed many of the monasteries on Mount Athos, and even sojourned there for a time with his wife Elena during the Black Death. His successor was also credited with endowing one of the surviving Athenite monasteries today, the Simonopetros, around 1364. The feverish and even entrepreneurial environment of Athos in this period is illustrated by the undertakings of one of its most charismatic monks, Hariton. When Hariton became the abbot of the monastery of Kudlumusiu around the middle of the 14th century, 1355 to 56, his community was, at least by Athenite standards, poor and unimportant. In 3 versions of his testament, as well as a further document transmitted by the monastery's archive, Hariton and his patron related how he sought to secure the economic basis of his community and increase its status by seeking patrons across the Orthodox world. This charismatic abbot was able to read the writing on the wall regarding the fate of the Byzantine state and quickly surmised that the Byzantine emperor and patrons from the empire would not be able to fund the expansion of his monastery. On its quotes, on its behalf, I not only appealed to prominent Romans to support me in this endeavor, but also those of other nationalities, from whose donations I endowed this monastery, with no small amount of possessions and funding, as well as a fair amount of property, unquote. Instead, the monastery's key patron, who would later be designated by Hariton and the rest of the monks of Kudlumusiu with the honorific title of Petitor, founder, was Vladislav I Vaiku, Prince of Valahia. Vladislav was ruler of a nascent Orthodox principality that had first gained independence from Hungary under his grandfather, Basarab I. Vladislav's father, Nicholas Alexander, had already begun to patronize the monastery, chiefly, so it would seem, by funding defensive works there. Vladislav himself would continue his father's patronage of the monastery, richly endowing Kudlumusiu, and thereby further enhancing the prestige of his new state. Indeed, in a document outlining his patronage activity, the Wallachian prince relates how Hariton had convinced him to become a benefactor of the monastery by emphasizing how Athos had become the new center of the Orthodox world, the Oikoumene. Quote, he, Hariton, said it would be fitting for my lordship to do what other lordships have already done, Serbs, Bulgarians, Rus, and Iberians, who have taken pains for the commemoration and honor on this wondrous and holy mountain, which is, one might say, the eye of the entire world, unquote. This phrase, the eye of the entire world, o ophthamos aphasis tis ekumenis in Greek, had previously been reserved for Constantinople, the queen of cities. That a Byzantine monk would now advertise the holy mountain rather than Constantinople as the center of the Orthodox universe, and that such an argument found a ready audience in the person of Vladislav, is reflective of the profound shift of gravity which had occurred within the geography of the Orthodox world after 1204. Athos, not Constantinople, was now seen as the most desirable site of Orthodox commemoration and perhaps the most prestigious Orthodox religious site. The case of Vladislav demonstrates that regardless of where a ruler died and was interred, and it does seem in almost all the cases of sovereigns endowing Athenite monasteries that they were not subsequently buried on the Holy Mountain, securing commemoration in this most prestigious monastic centers was worth much money and effort. A well-documented case of this trend is that of the Grand Komneni of Trebizond, who, though they were buried in Hagia Sophia in the capital of the Black Sea Kingdom, also sought commemoration on Athos. Another enterprising abbot, Dionysios, the contemporary of Hariton, likewise sought a wealthy patron to secure the future of the Athenite monastery he had founded shortly after the middle of the 14th century. Documents from the monastery's archive, as well as his vita, written in the 16th century, but based on an older version, show how this intrepid monk managed to attract patronage. Though Dionysios managed to attract the donation of various properties on the island of Lemnos from a number of prominent Byzantines, including relatives of the Emperor John V Paleologos, which were confirmed by an imperial crucible in 1364, these holdings apparently did not satisfy the ambitions that Dionysius had for his new monastery. When his brother became the metropolitan of Trebizond shortly thereafter, Dionysius visited him, and having impressed the Byzantine Emperor Alexius III with his ascetic way of life and holiness, he secured a significant endowment for his community by means of an imperial crucible issued in 1374. And here on the slide, you can see an illumination, a depiction of the emperor and his wife at the top of the crucible on the left. So this is an original of this crucible of Alexius III, issued in 1374, kept in the monastery of Dionysiou. And on the right, you also have, I think, a very nice later copy, 18th century copy of the monastery. Yes, so I will talk about this charter in somewhat more detail now. In this charter, the emperor played upon the origins of the father of Athenite communal monasticism, Athanasius, the founder of the Great Lavra and a native son of Trebizond. Quote, you might say that recently Athanasius was given to Athos from Trebizond, while Dionysios was given in return from Athos to Trebizond, unquote. Like Athanasius the Athenite himself, who had acquired imperial patronage for his Great Lavra in the person of Nicephorus Phocas, Dionysius convinced Alexius III to lavishly endow his own foundation. Trebizond would contribute 100 somia of gold, as well as a further annuity of 100 aspra, or silver coins, a year. This would allow Dionysius to provide his community with all the buildings necessary for a small monastery, including a church, a walled enclosure, cells, and an aqueduct. How had Dionysius induced the potentate of this Black Sea kingdom to display such generosity towards his monastery? One argument the abbot had employed was a variation on Hariton's statement that Athos had become the eye of the world. Dionysius is quoted in the charter as having stated, quote, for all emperors, kings, and priests have made themselves renowned by building for the holy mountain monasteries and cloisters for their undiluted memory. Since you excel many of them, it stands to reason that you must add something fitting to this, so that you might have, like many others, continuous commemoration and unending spiritual enjoyment. Unquote. Indeed, commemoration of Alexius's dynasty is heavily emphasized in the crucible. His forefathers quote those most famous emperors and heroes, the Grand Comini, may the monks intercede for him blessed with a ceaseless voice, unquote. Also to be commemorated were Alexius himself, his mother, consort, children, and future descendants. Nor did the quid pro quo on the part of the monks stop at commemoration. Two further conditions were imposed. First, Dionysius' new foundation was to be called the Monastery of the Grand Komnenos, a demand that, so it seems, was never actually realized. Second, any subjects of Trebizond desiring to join the monastic community, provided they were morally suitable, were to be accepted without hesitation by Dionysius. Though the Byzantine emperor also patronized Dionysius once more after Alexius III had issued his charter, it would be two further Grand Comini who would confirm Trebizond's special relationship with the monastery. And indeed, they are still commemorated by the monks of Dionysius to this day. It was not long after the establishment of these monasteries in the middle of the 14th century that Athos came under Ottoman protection for the first time. And Constantinople itself would succumb to the Ottoman advance in 1453. In my talk today, I do not have time to discuss how the Athenite communities accommodated themselves, quite successfully I might add, to Ottoman rule. Instead, I would like to return at this point in my few concluding remarks to the title of this lecture, namely Athos as the Eye of the Oikoumene. Over the last hour, I hope that I have sketched how what Marcus Aurelius described as a little cloud of the universe